In the Book of Revelation, the sea of glass signifies the petrification of primordial chaos into a rigid, crystalline grid. This environment represents a final victory characterized by repose and the eradication of risk. The virtues of the saints, their courage and faith, were defined by the dynamic tension of resisting that exact chaos. Their identities are inextricably linked to the struggle against an environment of risk. Martin Heidegger defined truth as aletheia, a state of unconcealment achieved through an active struggle against untruth. In a crystalline environment where truth is permanently and effortlessly disclosed, the subject's capacity to produce truth is rendered obsolete. When divine sovereignty achieves guaranteed security, the environment of risk dissolves. The historical subject, whose very selfhood was forged in that tension, finds that their identity has no remaining ontological function. If a subject is defined by the memory of its striving, a state of perfection that demands the cessation of that striving effectively erases the self. The mind realizes that entering this static eternity requires the destruction of the historical I. This crisis of meaning produces the Post-Apocalyptic Melancholic Subject, or PAMS. Traditional mourning fails here. Usually, a subject internalizes a loss and affirms a new reality. But in this case, the new reality, absolute security, is achieved at the cost of the subject's essence. The lost ideal is the internal, dynamic tension of striving that defined their life in time. To complete the work of mourning and accept the silence of the eternal present requires the subject to detach from the struggle that made them. To prevent this internal collapse, the eternal state requires a permanent material flaw, a way to anchor the historical self within the perfect environment. In this framework, melancholia becomes a successful philosophical act. It is the mind's refusal to allow the silence of the eternal present to consume the audible history of the past. We can resolve this impasse by triangulating philosophical positions, starting with a Derridean framework. The subject's refusal to let go of the struggle preserves the complexity of their subjective formation. This perpetual act of incorporation prevents the static environment from homogenizing their identity. Jacques Derrida argued that a state of triumph cannot simply discard the past. His critique demands that the memory of loss remains present. Derrida's concept of hauntology posits that any triumphant state is inevitably haunted by the specters of its own history. The post-apocalyptic subject performs this ethical duty. They haunt the new creation to ensure the eternal present does not erase the record of struggle. A state of triumph remains ethical only when it is structurally marked by the history of its own achievement. We begin with the pleroma, the infinite light of the divine essence. Ephraim the Syrian viewed the incarnation as God's voluntary humiliation, submitting completely to human fate. The physical retention of the crucifixion wounds validates this descent, acting as material traces of absorbed negativity. These wounds function as a kenotic restraint. They impose a willed limit on the divine light, preventing the infinite from consuming distinct finite beings. They serve as a metaphysical record. The wounds provide a permanent material anchor for historical identities, proving the reality of the struggle they endured. The scars are the structural engineering that allows finitude and eternity to intersect. The philosopher Alain Badiou proposed that subjectivity emerges through an event, a contingent rupture that breaks from the existing situation. Badiou demands fidelity to the event's pure novelty, transcending the past situation. But for the melancholic subject, abandoning the material traces of suffering means erasing the self. To preserve meaning, this system must be redirected. The subject maintains identity through fidelity to the wound. The subject directs their unyielding commitment away from the abstract triumph and toward the specific material trauma that achieved it. Eternal subjectivity is secured when the procedure of fidelity is synthesized with an absolute commitment to the Derridean trace of pain. The completed metaphysical architecture now shows a perfectly secure reality, grounded by a singular, permanent point of willed vulnerability. This internalized flaw creates a point of permanent undecidability, an aporia. This willed vulnerability destabilizes the threat posed by a static, risk-free environment. The subjects become eternal witnesses who affirm the triumph only through their commitment to the trauma it absorbed. Eternal worship is the active procedure of testifying that grace is inseparable from the memory of the struggle it conquered. Perfected being is the dynamic act of absorbed memory. The ultimate triumph is defined by the visible dignity of the debt the victor